Back in 2008, the world pretty much held its breath as the American financial system started to completely unravel. We're talking about a collapse so huge it almost took the entire global economy down with it. Banks we all thought were permanent fixtures, gone, just vanished overnight. People's life savings evaporated. The whole system was teetering right on the edge. So, how on earth did it all go so wrong?
Right, this isn't just a story about numbers on a spreadsheet or charts on a screen. No, this is a real-life timeline of greed, of incredible risk, and ultimately of devastating consequences. So let's break it down, step by step, and trace the path that led from a massive housing boom to one of the worst financial disasters in modern history.
Okay, let's go back in time. It's the early 2000s, the economy is humming along, and this idea of owning a home is being pushed as the absolute peak of the American dream. For generations, buying a house was like the golden rule of investing. It was considered the safest possible thing you could do with your money.
And this was the mantra you heard everywhere. Real estate only goes up. Wasn't just an opinion, it felt like a law of physics. And that belief, that total confidence, fueled a housing boom of epic proportions. Banks saw this and went into overdrive, aggressively pushing home loans, or mortgages, on pretty much anyone who would take one.
And this, right here, is where things start to get really sketchy. We're talking about subprime mortgages. Now, common sense would tell you that lending money to people with shaky finances is risky. But the banks? They saw gold mine. More loans meant more fees, which meant more profit, right? Now the risk? Well, that was tomorrow's problem. So how did they deal with all that risk? Well, they came up with this brilliant but ultimately toxic financial invention. They took thousands and thousands of these mortgages, the good ones, the bad ones, the really ugly ones, and basically threw them all into a financial blender. They bundled them into something called a mortgage-backed security, or MBS, and sold it off to investors around the world. The bank gets its profit up front, and the risk, well, somebody else's problem now.
And this just lit a fire under the whole system. With the risk seemingly off their books, lending standards just completely collapsed. Suddenly, people were getting approved for homes they had no realistic way of affording. A lot of these were tricky adjustable-rate mortgages, which were basically financial time bombs. They'd start with these super low, tempting payments, but they were designed to explode into much, much higher costs down the road.
Think about that. This entire multi-trillion-dollar global machine, this whole house of cards, was balancing on this one single, incredibly fragile idea that housing prices would just keep going up forever. Everything worked as long as that one thing held true. But what happens if it doesn't?
Well, by 2007, we found out that fragile assumption didn't just crack, it shattered. The endless, unstoppable rise in housing prices finally sputtered, stopped, and then started to drop. And yeah, the train was heading straight for a bridge that wasn't there anymore.
All at once, millions of American homeowners were trapped in a nightmare. Their homes were now worth less than what they owed on their mortgage. They were underwater. And at the exact same time, those ticking time bombs, the adjustable-rate mortgages, started going off, resetting to payments people just couldn't make. It wasn't a slow leak, it was a flood. Defaults skyrocketed.
And the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. House prices dropped, which led to a wave of defaults. Those defaults revealed just how toxic those mortgage-backed securities really were. And then came the moment that changed everything. September 2008. Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest, oldest investment banks in the world, went bankrupt. It collapsed.
The fall of a giant like Lehman sent a shockwave of pure, uncut panic through the entire financial world. No one knew who was safe, no one trusted anyone else, banks stopped lending to each other, and the flow of credit, which is basically the lifeblood of the global economy, it just froze solid.
With the entire system literally hours from a complete shutdown, the U.S. government had to step in. They launched these massive bailout programs, using taxpayer dollars to rescue the very banks and institutions that caused the crisis in the first place. But here's the thing. While Wall Street was being saved, regular people on Main Street were just getting crushed.
Because for millions and millions of people, this wasn't some abstract thing about stock tickers and financial markets. No, the consequences were deeply, deeply personal. It reshaped lives, it broke up families, and it devastated entire communities.
8.7 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many jobs were lost in the United States as the economy just plunged into what we now call the Great Recession. 8.7 million people who suddenly found themselves out of work.
And then there's this number, 6 million.
That is the number of families who lost their homes to foreclosure. 6 million American dreams that turned into an absolute nightmare of eviction notices and lost hope. The pain was everywhere you looked. People's retirement accounts were just wiped out. Small businesses, the heart of so many towns, had to close their doors for good. And you saw this profound anger start to grow, this deep sense that the system was working against them, that it was set up to protect the powerful while abandoning everyone else.
So the immediate five-alarm fire was put out, but the damage was done. The recovery that followed over the next decade, it was slow, it was painful, and it was deeply, deeply uneven.
And really, you see two different Americas emerge from the wreckage. On the one hand, you have Wall Street. Aided by all those bailout funds, corporations and banks bounced back pretty darn quickly. But for Main Street, it was a completely different story. It was a long, hard decade of stagnant wages and families fighting tooth and nail just to rebuild the wealth they lost. The gap between the rich and everyone else just got wider. And this feeling, this simmering anger, gave rise to protest movements like Occupy Wall Street. It all boiled down to this one simple, powerful idea that captured the frustration of a generation. The system is rigged. So when you look back, why did this happen? Well, it was really a perfect storm. You had corporate greed that put short-term profits way ahead of any long-term responsibility. You had bad incentives that rewarded people for taking reckless risks. There was this blind, almost religious faith that housing could never go down. You had government regulators who were asleep at the wheel. And finally, our global system was so interconnected that when America caught a cold, the entire world got a really bad case of pneumonia. To put it as simply as possible, the whole financial system had been re-engineered to reward taking bigger and bigger and bigger risks. And you know what? It worked like a charm, right up until the moment it blew up the entire world. And this really gets to the heart of it. The 2008 crash was so much more than a recession. It was like a mirror was held up to the entire country. It forced a long, hard look at the real dangers of unchecked greed and a system that had completely lost its way.
Because at the end of the day, the 2008 financial crash was not a hurricane or an earthquake. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the direct result of choices. Choices made by banks, choices made by regulators, and choices made by our society as a whole. And that leaves us with a really critical question. Knowing everything we know now, are we making better choices today?